Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. You're listening to IXIAtalks episode 11, Using Metadata to Deliver Findable Content. I'm Sydney Jones, your host today and Head of Marketing Communications here at IXIASOFT. IXIAtalks is a webinar series that covers data, agile document management, localization, IXIASOFT's very own CCMS, and more. Episodes are released monthly and cover a wide range of topics in the technical communications industry. Before we get started, there are a few things that you should know. Right off the bat, you are all muted. So if you're worried if we can hear you or not, don't worry, we can't hear anything, so you're completely silent. Secondly, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send you a link to this about an hour or so after it airs. And lastly, if you would like to share or ask a question during the webinar, you can type this into the questions section of your control panel at any point during the presentation, and we will answer all of these, or as many as we can in the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So now onto the show. Our special guests today are Megan Gilhooly from Zoomin and Leigh White from IXIASOFT. So welcome to IXIAtalks to both of you. We're very thrilled to have you.
Thanks, Sydney. Glad to be here.
So before we get into the topic, I will let both of you introduce each other. I know you have known each other over the years through various conferences and other events. So Leigh, why don't you start by introducing Megan to our audience?
Sure. So yeah, I have known Megan professionally for several years, but it's been really nice to finally have an opportunity to work with her on this webinar. As you can see, she's currently based in Seattle, but she's about to move to the equally beautiful city of Denver. She is currently with Zoomin, but she has had a number of roles at other companies, most recently Amazon. And she's been a Zoomin customer in previous roles as well, so she's sort of seen the process from both sides. But with Zoomin, she's currently focused on their customer experience. She began in journalism, and then, like many of us, took an indirect path into technical writing, and then marketing, and then management. And she's been managing XML and data implementations for 10 years, so a lot of experience there. And something that you probably don't know about Megan is that she is a former kickboxer as well as a running back for the Colorado Valkyries, which is a women's pro football team.
That's right. Thanks for that, Leigh. So I will introduce Leigh. So Leigh is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and she is with IXIASOFT, where she's been since 2013. And prior to that, I know that you were a customer of IXIASOFT with Allscripts and potentially some other companies as well. One thing about Leigh is she has been in the data world since 2007, working in XML for 2 decades, and she literally wrote the book on data. So definitely a brilliant data mind here. And then one other thing about Leigh that you guys probably don't know is that she's a woodworker, and so she does a lot of really beautiful woodworking stuff. So I will be commissioning her soon to help me when I move into my place in Denver to help beautify it with some good wood art or something.
Thank you both. I actually didn't know that about you, Leigh, but that's very interesting. Just to give you an overview as to what we'll be getting into today. So first off, we've already done our introductions. Next up, we'll move into customer experience, so the good and the bad, and a few examples of both. Next up will be the planning of the experience, followed by how taxonomy helps you deliver the experience, and finally, information flow from CCMS to delivery. And then, as per usual, we'll wrap up with the Q&A session at the end. So I will hand the mic over to Megan.
Thank you, Sydney. So we're going to be going back and forth a bit between Leigh and I. I'm going to start by describing what findable content is and really why that's important for the customer experience. So by findable, we mean easy for someone to locate the data, the information, or the knowledge. So in today's digital world, that typically means relying on search or navigational structure. And it's important to note that customers really want to find the information they need, no matter where that content lives, no matter what the format is, and of course in an increasingly shorter amount of time. So there are a few things that we're going to talk about what not to do in terms of customer experience. So Leigh, I think you wanted to tee this one up.
Yeah, so, we've all seen something like what you see in front of you now. So imagine, you're working on a product, you're in the middle of something, you're on a deadline, you're in a hurry, you're completely stumped, you can't figure out what to do from the product itself. So finally, you go to the company's website to look for your answers, and you see something like this. You see just a blank search field that says search in documentation, or, search white papers, search solutions. Maybe you see several different fields like this, and right away, now you're even more stumped because you don't know which one to use. You don't know if the answer that you want is in documentation. You don't know if the answer that you want is in solutions. And you don't know even what to look for. So you just start typing in some keywords and you hope for the best. And you'll probably get some results, and you may even get pages and pages of results. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. You have no idea where to go from there. So have you had this experience, Megan?
Yeah, in fact, these search boxes came from somewhere that I may have worked, which I will not say. But yeah, I mean, really what this is doing is it's exposing content silos to our customers. So when you're on the doc site, you can only search in documentation. When you're on the white paper site, you can only search for white papers. And when you're in solutions, you can only search for solutions. And so certainly that's not a great way to go, because our customers want to be able to come in, do one search, stay in the place they're at, and get all of the relevant information surfaced to them right there. So that takes us to the flip side, which is, what should we do? So now imagine that you go to a company's website and you have a series of choices. You select the button or the product, then the version, then maybe the module, and so on, until you get to something very specific that answers the question or solves the problem that you're having. So now then maybe you can even add a keyword to search within that narrows the field. Maybe you have dozens of links instead of hundreds of links, which is much better. And that is totally manageable. And so that's a much better way of looking at it. And Leigh, do you want to talk through Progress? Progress is a customer of both of ours, and they have a really, really nice layout.
Sure. Yes, they do. They are a great example of what to do. So when you come to the site, the first thing you see is, yes, there is a search bar at the top. So if you do know what you're looking for, you can go ahead and enter that keyword, and you'll get immediately to your results. But if you're not sure what you're looking for, there are other options. So there are two panels on the bottom of the screen for products, OpenEdge and Corticon. So immediately you know what product you're working in, so you can go to the right one. So let's have a look at the OpenEdge site. So when you come into OpenEdge, you immediately see there are these 4 roles. Now, unlike some companies that go ahead and restrict what you see on the back end based on your login, Progress doesn't do that. They let you self-select your role. You know who you are, you know what you're doing. So you can then drill in by role, or if you scroll down a little more, you could also drill down farther by category. So let's just look at the role right now. Let's go into the system administrator role. And if you go in there, of course, you see a description of the role just to verify that, maybe you do several different things at your company, and you want to make sure that you are in the right area. So yes, you are in fact working at this moment as a system administrator. Your tasks are related to system administration. So then you have a number of items down below that you can select. And notice that one of them is labeled as a video, and presumably the others are different kinds of documentation, but there's no silo here. Everything that has to do with system administration and all of that is all together. It's not siloed by documentation type. So let's have a look at manage PAS for OpenEdge. So when you go into there, you see this really nice sort of learning diagram here, where the different things that you can do are sort of organized by category, by work category. And so as you mouse over different things, different areas of documentation become available to you. So let's just pick, I don't know, let's just pick Tomcat load balancing just for grins, just to see what's there. And so now you have, some information about Tomcat load balancing. You have a very nice diagram, and you have some related links over here that can take you where you want. So this site is a good example of how you can take your users by the hand and lead them down a path to the documentation that they need to perform their specific task.
Yeah, that is a really, really good example. And we're going to talk about the difference between the what not to do and the what to do. And then we're going to get into kind of how this works and how we make this happen. So as you can see on the next slide, the differences between the two, there are a few big differences. The first is the second slide is personalized. It is tailored directly to the needs of the person in that role. It's directly personalized to the learning that that person needs to do. And it presumably has really fresh content as well. So that's one big thing. Leigh, do you want to cover the second?
Yeah, can we go back to the previous slide? Thanks. So yes, so in addition to the personalized fresh content, of course, you can present personalized content as a simple list, and that's fine. But you can also give it a more intuitive design and a more intuitive organization. So the progress site is a good example. It was very clear from the start that there were two products, and you needed to click the appropriate product button to go into documentation for that product. And then everywhere else you wanted to go was quite clear. And even the example here on this slide is also pretty clear. Are you looking in the knowledge base? Are you looking in, for the documentation? Do you want to contact support? It's pretty clear what you need to do. So site design obviously is a very important part of providing a good user experience with your documentation. So, okay, how do you get to such a site? So you know what you need to do. You know you want this, right? Well, how do you get there? So there are really three things, but the big thing, as with any kind of project, is planning. You have to plan. You have to plan what you want to do. You can't just plunge in there and start throwing things together and expect to have a good result. So you've got to really sit down and plan. The 80-20 rule really holds here. 80% planning, 20% execution. And then, of course, with respect to your content, you need to categorize your content with a good, robust taxonomy, which is something we're going to talk about extensively in this presentation. And then other types of metadata that you can also add to enhance your content and your user experience. So, Megan, do you want to start by talking about some aspects of the planning process?
Absolutely. So the first thing that you want to do when you're planning is you want to sit down and discuss the kind of experience you want your customers to have. You can't go into this blind. You absolutely have to think about the customer first and then work backwards. And there are various ways you can do that. Leigh, do you want to discuss a couple ways?
Sure. So the first thing that I tell people is, shoot for the moon, right? Get in a room and talk about if you could design your perfect documentation website, time, money, resources, no object, what would it be? You may not get there in the first pass, but you've got to have the dream, right? So you've got to at least have, you know, your ideal scenario, and then you can start sort of working, you know, backwards from that. Design on paper first. Just sit down and, you know, with paper, whiteboard, whatever, and just draw pictures of what you think, you know, the website would look like. The kinds of layout you would like to have, the kinds of path you would like to lead your users down. Don't worry about how you're going to make that happen. Don't worry about the technology. Don't worry about the tools. Don't even necessarily worry about how you're going to make your content fit into such a site. Just design it on paper. Design your ideal scenario.
That's right. And so again, working backwards from the customer experience that you want is super important. I love that you said don't worry about the technology right away. Worry about the experience first. Once you've designed the experience, then you can start figuring out how to create it. So that's great. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about faceted search. And faceted search is something that your planning will definitely impact. If you have really good planning, your faceted search will turn out well. If you fail to plan, your faceted search will be an epic fail. And so let's talk in detail about that. So a key part of any good search experience is the idea of facets. And in case you don't know what faceted search is when you think of, like, when you go to Amazon and you're searching for a specific thing, let's say shoes, you can drill into different categories to get closer and closer to the exact item you're looking for. That's faceted search. And so adding facets to a search allows you to increasingly narrow your search to arrive at exactly what you need. So when you're on Amazon, if you're searching for shoes, you're going to end up with a facet called shoe size. But if you're searching for pants, you're not going to have a facet called shoe size. You're going to have just size or a different type of sizing. So this really helps you drill down into what you need. And with our content, we do exactly the same thing, because ultimately our customers have a question or a problem that they're trying to solve, and they want to drill down in to get exactly the answer for exactly the product and the version that they're looking for, and something specific to their role. And so that's where faceted search comes in. And of course, this is driven by taxonomy. So Leigh, do you want to talk about how taxonomy drives this?
Absolutely. So a taxonomy, and we're going to talk more about what taxonomy is. Megan's going to explain that a little better. But a taxonomy is the thing that sets up those facets. It sets up those categories, and it sets up that hierarchy between those categories. And so we're going to look at an example of taxonomy later. But right now, Megan's going to kind of give us the scientific definition of a taxonomy. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about how that, how you make that come to pass, what the practical definition and usage of a taxonomy is. So Megan?
Right, very nice, very nice. So a taxonomy, from a scientific definition, is really the science or technique of classifying stuff. So putting stuff into categories, categorizing kind of anything. We categorize mammals, they categorize birds, they categorize everything in science. On the next page, we're going to look at how this applies more generally to content. So if we think about taxonomy, it's really a hierarchical list of terms representing semantic subjects or categories. So I want you to think of this like a filing strategy. So for those of you who are old enough to have actually used a filing cabinet, you could think of the files that are pictured here. For those of you who might not have ever used a filing cabinet, think about how you file stuff on your computer desktop. And so really how you file can change depending on how you're going to use the information later, right? So when you're filing, let's say I'm going to file my personal files, I can decide to do one folder for auto at a high level, one folder for house, one folder for medical, one folder for kids, and so on. And within auto, I might set it up so that I have inside auto, I have insurance, and I have maintenance, and I have financing. But then I might look and say, yeah, but under house, I'm also going to have insurance and maintenance and financing. And so I need to kind of think about, do I want auto and house to be together? Probably not necessarily. Is it okay to have the same subcategories under two different files? Probably, depending on how I'm going to use it. So we have to really think about how we're going to go search for the information to understand how to set up the big product domains and subtopics that we have. And of course, with our content, it's going to be far more complex than my filing cabinet was. So that's definitely an important note. And so how we organize this is really, really, really important, Leigh.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the organization is everything. And your point about the filing cabinet is great because it points out what could be an advantage or disadvantage with digital content. When you're filing a piece of paper in a filing cabinet, or you're filing a book on a library shelf, it's a physical thing, and it obviously has to go in one place or another, even if it might apply to several different categories. And so you have to make a choice. But the wonderful thing about organizing digital content is that it's not really in a place. It can go anywhere, and you can apply any number of taxonomy terms to it that apply equally. You don't sort of have to make a choice, or you don't have to necessarily set a priority. So sometimes the freedom that affords you can be overwhelming, and then there's so many possibilities that you get paralyzed by indecision. But you can start with there are some tips, some tricks to help you kind of get started. So on the next slide, I'll talk about a few of those. So if you've already done your customer experience planning and you kind of know where you would like your customers to start when they first come to your site, and then where they're going to go after that, and then where after that, then you probably already have a good idea of how many levels you need and what those might be. Now, obviously you don't want to be forcing your customers to keep drilling down and drilling down and drilling down. So you probably don't want a 15-level taxonomy. I would say somewhere between 4 and 7 levels is probably optimal. It's a good balance between specificity and usability. But you should start by sketching this out on paper as well. So it's just a hierarchical list of terms, so you can pretty easily sketch that out. And we'll look at one a little later, so you'll have an example to kind of start with. But you may not have to start from scratch. So some organizations might already have a corporate taxonomy. So check to see if your company does have such a thing. Check with your webmaster, check with your marketing group, check with your product development group, and see if they already have some kind of taxonomy that they're using. This may or may not work for you, but go ahead and check it out. It may be a good starting point. The same thing, marketing may have a taxonomy. Those tend to be rather different from documentation taxonomies, but it still may be a good starting point. And you might be able to leverage existing taxonomies and expand them to suit everybody, so that you're able to sort of unify all of the company taxonomies into one overriding taxonomy that makes sense for everybody. Or you may not. You may have to go your own way with this. But at any rate, check to see what's already there before you just start from scratch. And there are, many commercial tools, commercial and open source tools available for creating taxonomy. So you can go with something like Pool Party, that is a very popular one, or Synaptica or Protégé. And they allow you to create taxonomies in formats that you can then export and use with other software, such as a CCMS. Megan, what's been your experience there?
I think one of the biggest things I would say about creating your taxonomy is don't feel like you need to go out and get the fancy tools right off the bat. In fact, not only don't feel like you have to, don't do it. Start with what we talked about, the planning on the paper. And Leigh, you actually had a really good suggestion one time about using index cards, and just maybe get a big group of people together and come up with all of the different potential facets you can think of, put them down on an index card, one on each card, and then start organizing the cards and moving them around, because that's a really easy way to move it around. It also can end up being a really good team building experience. So it's a good way to get everyone on board, especially if you're trying to create a taxonomy that will hold over multiple departments. So that's definitely something I would do. But once you do all that, then of course those commercial tools can be very helpful as well. So now moving from taxonomy to subject scheme. Subject scheme is really, so this is an XML-based taxonomy standard, and Zoomin uses subject scheme specifically to create faceted search. And of course, IXIASOFT uses it as well. And so Leigh, do you want to talk a little bit about the way that IXIASOFT uses subject scheme?
Sure, I'll talk about it at a high level right now because I'm actually going to show an example of it at the end of the presentation. But when you create a taxonomy in IXIASOFT CCMS, you're actually creating a subject scheme behind the scenes. And so that's very nice because it is a standard. And of course, that also means that if you're creating a subject scheme by using the CCMS's feature, that implies, and it's true, that you could create that subject scheme elsewhere in some other tool or with Notepad, whatever, and then you could import that into the CCMS. So you could, maintain your taxonomies in some other tool and then import them for use into the CCMS. But we will look at an example of how all of that happens in a few minutes.
Okay, great. So let's look at, on the delivery side, how taxonomies sort of render into what we're doing. So we'll start with weighted search. And weighted search really is when so we all know what search suggestions are. When you start typing, then into the search bar, you get a list of suggestions. Now, taxonomy can be used to weight the search so that the things that are more relevant come up first. Now, there are a few different ways that we can use taxonomy and metadata specifically to weight our search. So the first is we do it based on authentication. So let's say I'm logged in as somebody who the system knows is a system administrator and is using version 7.2 of product XYZ. So as soon as I start typing in, let's say, admin, it's going to pull up the administrative stuff relevant to a system admin for 7.2 on product XYZ. And that will pull up first, and the other stuff will sort of fall down below. This also, authentication can also help ensure that we have entitlement. So if there's stuff that I as a user shouldn't see, that a system admin should, and I go in as a user, then I won't see the stuff that I'm not allowed to see. So authentication is a big way to use metadata and taxonomy to support your weighted search. Then there's also preferences. So preferences would be things you sort of opt into. And you can have this be similar to the progress site that we showed earlier that doesn't actually have a login. They were able to opt in by choosing, by sort of self-selecting their role. That's kind of a preference. But you can actually have a very specific preferences page where people can choose what they want to see first, second, and third. And so if a user indicates that they only want to see content for version 6.5, then the relevant results for version 7.1 can be hidden. So they're not going to show up in this weighted search. Or you might have it show up, but much lower. The third thing that we can use to help weight the search that's really cool is the previous actions or the previous behaviors of the user. So if I go in and I don't have preferences set for the version of the product and it's not indicated in my authentication method, but I did a search for 6.5, then we want the system to remember that and then to weight the search according to that. So the next time I try and search for something, we want it to weight 6.5 higher because the system remembers that that's something I've looked for in the past. So these are different ways to sort of render your metadata and taxonomy into weighted search. Leigh, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would just add that, we probably encounter weighted search every day. I mean, probably every one of us does at least one Google search every day. And as you know, you start typing and, you type in why do, why does, where are, anything. And generally Google will give you some suggestions. And these suggestions are examples of weighted search. Now, sometimes they're downright funny. And you wonder, well, where is this coming from? Like you might type in like why does, and then the suggestion might be something like, why does my dryer swallow my socks, or something like that. And you think, really, is this something that people have been looking for a lot? And the answer may be yes. The answer may be that people just has a sense of humor, which I think it does. But these suggestions come from preferences and previous actions. So they do come from what are popular searches. If there's something happening in the news that a lot of people are looking for, that's probably going to pop up in a suggestion. Or if it's something that you have searched for in the past, that's probably going to pop up as a suggestion as well. So think about, do you want to provide this kind of feature for your users? When they start typing in a term or something like that, do you want to provide meaningful suggestions for them? And if so, then you want to employ weighted search in the same way that Google does.
I love your example of the laundry eating the socks, because I'm pretty sure my kids ask Alexa that every single day. So that's a good one. All right, so more things to know about weighted search. The first is it really should be seamless to the customer. The customer shouldn't even know that you're weighting the search for them. It should just be so easy for them to get to where they need to be, and it's like the system knows them, right? And so that's really important. And the second is there's suggestions and then there's filters. And so if we think about suggestions would be additive, meaning they're typing something and we're adding other possibilities. And then filtering out means you're taking stuff away, right? So when we think about suggestions, we're thinking about adding other stuff they might be interested in, but there's still this idea behind the scenes of filtering out the stuff that's not relevant to them. And that goes back to the entitlements that we talked about. If I'm a user and I don't have the entitlements for what the system admin can see, I'm not going to see it. So it's important to think about those terms specifically. And then really think about what metadata belongs in your content versus what's driven by taxonomy. And Leigh can talk more about that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things you can do with your content that are sort of technically metadata, but you probably don't think of them that way, that don't involve taxonomy at all, but they're just good content practices. And this provides information that a weighted search can leverage. So for example, keywords, now those may or may not be so important anymore. A lot of search engines don't even index them anymore. They used to be more important than they are now. But still some internal sites use them. So find out if keywords are going to be a thing for you. And even if they're not, things that you could have been using as keywords, you might think of transferring them out into taxonomy metadata, because they are words that characterize the content of the topic. So they may be very useful as taxonomy. But one really important thing you can do to help your customers find your content are descriptive titles with uniform terminology. So all of us who've ever worked as tech writers, at one time or another, we find in our content inventory that we have 50 topics whose title is overview or introduction. And this might make sense in the context of a manual or some complete piece of documentation. But on the web, where there is no context, it makes no sense whatsoever. So if someone does a search and they get as a result a topic that's called introduction, well, introduction to what? There's nothing to tell them what that topic is about. So descriptive titles that really talk about or describe the content of the topic with uniform terminology. So that's using the same term for the same thing all the time, and also even doing things like, making sure that every procedure is titled beginning with a verb. So configure the whatever, add a whatever, modify whatever, or you can do it with gerunds or whatever. But whatever you pick, be uniform about it. So when someone sees that topic in a list of topics returned from a search, it's immediately obvious what that topic is going to be about, and whether it's going to be a conceptual topic or a procedural topic, or just what. And by the same token, short descriptions are also very useful in this regard. And short descriptions they're kind of controversial. Some people love them and some people hate them, and some people don't even want to use them, but they are really helpful here because they're going to provide that line or two of descriptive text under the title in the search results, which is going to give people a little bit more information about what that particular topic is going to be, to let them know if that's the link they need to click on or not. So that's another little bit of hand-holding and help that you can give to your users to find content. And then something like alt text. That's very important for a lot of reasons. Number one, it allows things like your images to be better indexed by a search, because there's some text that can be indexed. But of course, it's also an aid to any of your users who might be using things like screen readers and things like that. And it also just provides some text in case, for whatever reason, the image itself doesn't render. At least they can mouse over the big blank spot and see what that image should be. Now, what doesn't belong in your content with respect to weighted search is basically, it's kind of hard to define a negative, but it's really anything you can capture with taxonomy. So these categories, like the product, like the version, like the user role, things like that, that doesn't belong in your content. You don't need to add that using, data or other meta or anything like that in your content. That you can capture with a taxonomy at a higher level, at a map level, and you can make that kind of information contextual to that map, because a topic that might pertain to product A in the context of one map might pertain to product B in the context of another map. And so you can capture that at the map level and have that information cascade down through all of the topics when you create your output. And you don't have to worry about capturing it at a topic by topic level, which is can be kind of limiting with your content. It makes content.
That's all really good suggestions, Leigh. Very, very nice. Let's move on to intentional publish dates. So intentional publish dates, why would we need publish dates? So let's think about this. The primary benefit, of course, is to show the freshness of content, really. We don't necessarily always need the publish dates anymore, but it is good to have dates to give an idea of how fresh your content is. And your CCMS can actually render this date by, let's say, the last time it was updated in your IXIASOFT CCMS, it would show on Zoomin, last updated on that particular date. And so that's the last published date is a really easy thing that can be done. You don't necessarily have to add it separately as metadata, kind of back to what Leigh was just saying about making it easy. If your CCMS can do it, just have your CCMS do it. You do have to, however, think about the frequency it changes. So for example, if you're doing a really minor update, you're just changing a typo, do you really want your last updated to reflect that typo change? Maybe the actual update you did to the content itself, like the meaning of the content and what features it covers, maybe that hasn't been done for 6 months, but if you go in and you just do one minor little grammatical change, you probably don't want it to say updated on a certain date. So we have to think about how that works. And you have to think about the customer experience. You have to think about how they're using the content. And then you have to make a decision on how you want that to be rendered in your delivery tool. Leigh, do you want to cover some more suggestions on dates?
Sure. Just a thought, a thing to consider is, back in the day when we were actually shipping documentation with products, it was stale the minute it went out the door. And so it was important for people to have some sort of, published on date on the PDF or whatever, so that if they saw that that PDF was 6 months old, they could maybe go to your website and download a more recent copy. But now that everything on your website is always the latest iteration, the latest update, ask yourself what value there is in actually exposing this last revised or last published date on. There may be value, there may not. Think about it. If someone is coming out there to see how to do a process that they're doing right now, they only need to know the state of that process right now. So in that case, maybe the last, the published date is not that important. But if they're, doing a process that takes some time, or they got started a few days ago, they got pulled away, they've come back to it now, and they see that their topic has been updated since they started, well, that's important for them to know, because there's a possibility that they might have to go back and revisit some of the work they've already done in case the process changed. But again, that can also create a situation where if you expose that date and you, as customers in that situation, then you might have to provide them a way to see the previous iteration of the content so they can see what actually changed from when they started to now, so that they don't have to make a guess or go back and start over, or kind of, you don't want to leave it up to them to sort of mentally diff the content. So just think about, if you're going to expose that date, you may have to follow up with some additional functionality. So let's talk about another sort of elephant in the room with respect to our content, and that is related links. So you obviously want to provide those in your content. Back in the day, you actually created the related links in the topics. Either you physically or you manually created a related links at the bottom of your topic, and that was horrible because it required constant maintenance. Someone had to maintain those links. It created dependencies between topics that could really limit your reuse. And so fortunately, you don't see a lot of people doing that anymore. Relationship tables came along. They're a little bit better. They don't inherently create the links. They create them at build time, but someone still has to maintain those links by hand. They have to keep those relationship tables updated. And so obviously that's something you want to get away from. So Megan, do you want to talk about better ways to maintain those related links?
Yes, I would love to. There are so many better ways than to do it manually. After a number of years of managing teams who are trying to maintain links and topics. So today, we can use a lot of the same concepts that we've already talked about today. So the first would be have the taxonomy drive your list of related links. And the way that this works is, remember we said that the taxonomy is a hierarchical list. So if you think about the first level of the taxonomy would be apparent to the children, which are in the second level below it. So if we're looking for shoes, then under shoes, we have shoe size. So shoe size is a child to shoes. So when we look at a taxonomy-driven list of related links, in essence, what it's doing is it's looking at the taxonomy and it's saying this topic is XYZ, and all of the children of that particular topic XYZ are going to show up as related content, and they'll just show up in a separate location. And of course, this would be dynamic. So if the taxonomy changes or the content within that's that's connected to the taxonomy changes, it automatically changes. So there's no maintaining it. The second method would be authentication driven. And so in essence, this is surfacing links that would be appropriate or related to this topic based on the role of the user logged in or any other data you have based on login. So if you know that this particular user is on a certain version, then you only pull up related links about that version. The third would be the preferences that we talked about earlier. So we have actual opt-in where people say, yes, I'm interested in this topic, I'm interested in this topic. So we're going to make sure that the related links either weight higher the ones that they have a preference for, or just include the ones that they have a preference for. The best of all worlds is to have your recommendations that are dynamic. So these are things that change based on the current user's actions, regardless of their login status or preferences. So this goes back to, it has to remember your behavior and what you've done as a user, and then it dynamically changes that list of related links based on the behaviors of the users. These are, in my opinion, much better ways to personalize your content, and they take away that horrible job of maintaining related inline links. Leigh, do you have anything else to say about that?
Well, I don't, but I think that it's probably time to take a brief look at some taxonomy in action. So we're looking at the taxonomy feature in the IXIASOFT CCMS, and obviously this is one implementation. This is our implementation. There are many different implementations. But in the IXIASOFT CCMS, we have a feature where you can create a taxonomy. So this happens to be Progress's taxonomy, and this is what drives the Progress website that you saw earlier. And as you can see, it's a pretty simple taxonomy. So even though the website is quite sophisticated, it doesn't mean that they have this enormous complicated taxonomy driving it. You don't necessarily have to. But you can see that they have three top level categories: access, format, and product, and each of those have children. There's a human readable term on the left. There's a vocabulary term on the right. In their case, it's the same, but it could be different. So your vocabulary term could be something more machine readable, and your human readable term, of course, is what would be exposed to your users in a faceted search. So once you have created this taxonomy, going to the next screen, this is what it looks like behind the scenes. So it is, in fact, a subject scheme. And this is, there's nothing unusual about this. This is quite ordinary subject scheme syntax here. And so because it's a standard, you can, this is portable anywhere. And you can also create this with any tool that can create a subject scheme. So that could be anything from Notepad++ to Oxygen to some of those tools I mentioned earlier. And so once this is created, it lives in the CCMS. You can export it, and in fact, it is exported to Zoomin when you use Zoomin for your dynamic publishing. So this is what it looks like here, pretty simple. And then let's look at the next screenshot. So this is an example of applying those terms to your content. So in this case, I actually applied these to a topic, which I would not recommend doing. I would recommend applying your taxonomy terms to your maps. And then when you generate your content, you can have those taxonomy terms cascade down automatically to each of your topics. And so the advantage of this is, well, number one, you're not trying to apply taxonomy terms to a gazillion topics. You're applying them to, a far smaller number of maps. And also your deliverables are map based. And so your taxonomy is actually centered around the map and the deliverable rather than the individual topics. But the process for assigning these terms to a topic or a map is exactly the same. I have the document here in the lower right corner. I've chosen format documentation. From the format category, I've chosen product open edge. And notice that by assigning these two terms to it, I've actually assigned not only the term, but also its parent. So I'm actually assigning 4 terms here, and that makes sense because in a faceted search, if I only drill down as far as format, I want to include this topic. If I only drill down as far as product, I want to include this topic. Or if I drill farther down into the more specific format documentation or product open edge, I still want to include this. So I want to include every level at which I could potentially find this piece of content with a faceted search. And so let's look at the next screenshot. And this is just an example of how the taxonomy metadata is added to the content in the IXIASOFT CCMS. Again, this is just our implementation. There are many other potential implementations, but here are my 4 categories. And you can see the human readable term and the data type, which just specifies that this data element is a taxonomy data element, because there are many, many uses for the data element. And some ID stuff, and then the value, which is going to be the whole faceted path, basically, that's going to be created in the faceted search. And so then this information is in your map, and when it is sent to your dynamic publishing system, that system consumes this metadata and references back to the subject scheme that accompanies it, and it creates the faceted search that your customers will see. Now the progress site did not have an overt faceted search. It didn't have, check boxes on the left, expandable, and all of that. But it had an implied faceted search, because we drilled down to product, and then we could drill to role, and then we could drill to, different things. So there is an implied faceted search built on this taxonomy. So this is one sort of concrete example of how you can build a very simple taxonomy that can really buy you a whole lot of user experience functionality. And so
that's awesome. Thanks for going through that, Leigh. That's a great example to see. We are getting near time, so we want to make sure if there's any questions that we maybe have time for 1 or 2. So
Certainly.
Sydney,
So
do we
actually
have questions?
We have quite a few, so we'll try and get through as many as we can here. So the first question we have is weighted search slide. Do you have other resources for creating affecting titles for each topic type? Concept, ref, task, troubleshooting.
Sounds like a data book that maybe Leigh has written.
I haven't written it, but there are so many resources about creating effective data titles. I would just Google that, creating effective data titles. The main thing is, find the right balance between explicitness and wordiness. You don't want some gigantic, 30-word title, but you do want the title to be explanatory and intuitive. Terminology, always using the same term to refer to the same thing, always using the same format. Are we going to start with a gerund? Are we going to start with this? We're going to start with that. Those are probably the most important tips right there. But yeah, I could go on and on about that. It's another presentation in and of itself, but just Google it. There's tons of resources.
Okay.
And
so
ask your data folks if they have an information model. So if there's an information model, it may already be specified for your organization.
Absolutely.
Okay, so our next question is, how can I go about creating a taxonomy and building a user experience like the one you showed if I'm the only tech writer in my company? I don't really have any time, budget, or support to do something like that.
I wish there was like a magic button we could hand out, but that's probably, my gut is that you're going to have to find either time, budget, or people. I mean, you're not going to be able to do a taxonomy without one of those things. But Leigh, what would you say?
Well, I would agree. I mean, you can certainly sit down by yourself and you can, sketch out what your ideal user experience would be. And you can certainly if you're the only tech writer, you probably know your content pretty well, and so you can start, sketching out that taxonomy for it also. But there's only so much you're going to be able to do by yourself. You're going to have some help, and you're going to have some money to do it with, unfortunately.
Right. So it's more about making sure that you are justifying the time, the budget, or the people, so that you can get those things to be able to do this appropriately.
If you come up with a good plan and you can pitch it, then you may be able to get that budget and those resources.
Right.
Okay, so we'll take one more question before we end our webinar today. And this question is, if you could please explain again the difference or correlation between taxonomy, ontology, and faceted search. Thank you.
Sure. So a taxonomy is, think of it as the filing strategy, right? So it's the hierarchical list where you start broad and then you kind of drill down. Now, an ontology is very related, but it's different. It has more to do with the relationships and various relationships between various, say, terms within your taxonomy. So it's a much more complex version of a taxonomy and a much less linear version of a taxonomy. The faceted search, or the facets, are really driven by your taxonomy or ontology. If you have an ontology that's potentially even more complex, you can drive your facets off of that. But the facets are what live on your site that help the user drill into various topics based on usually your taxonomy. And the taxonomy is where we were focused today. Hopefully that helps.
I would add real quick, if you're interested in reading more about taxonomies, I can recommend a very good book. It's called The Accidental Taxonomist by Heather Hedden. It's very readable, very approachable, and just full of great information about taxonomy.
Thanks, Leigh. So there are a few questions that we unfortunately will not have time to answer today, but we'll get back to you individually with the answers to those later this afternoon. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Leigh and Megan for participating today. This has been a super informative webinar, so thank you very much to you both for being here. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
You bet. Thanks for having us. It was fun.
It was fun. So our next webinar will be on Thursday, January 30th at the usual time of 11 a.m. In this webinar, we'll be with IXIASOFT's very own UX designer, Solène Carbonel. So stay tuned for more details. I'll be sending out an email in the next few weeks detailing the title and the abstract of that presentation. And if you'd like to be featured in one of our webinars or you have an idea that you'd like to pitch, just shoot us an email at team.ccms@ixiasoft.com. So thanks so much to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today, and we'll see you soon.